Good afternoon. My name is Kathy Wozniak, Vice President of Education and CFUW Board Representative, one of the representatives to the Charitable Trust Board. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. CFUW members participating in this meeting will be attending from locations from coast to coast to coast that are on traditional territories of Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, which has been inhabited for over 11,000 years. From my location just north of Toronto, I'm speaking from traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe people, whose presence here continues to this day. The land I'm on is the meeting place of two treaties, lands of the Mississauga of the Credit, and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaty. We seek to live in respect, peace, and right relations, acknowledging the enduring presence of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people on this land. We thank them for sharing it with us, understanding our responsibilities for an ongoing commitment to work towards reconciliation. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you would like to, please identify your club beside your name. You can use the three dots at the top of your little square. Please stay on mute unless you're the person actually presenting today. And if you have any questions for the speaker, please put them in the chat. I'll monitor and ask Casey to respond after her presentation because the question you asked early may be answered later on. Okay, I will now call on Doris May Olton to start our meeting. You have to unmute yourself, Doris May. Uh-oh. There we are. Okay.
Now, am I unmuted?
There you go.
Yay. Kathy can tell you my challenge in computers is making me feel like I'm a rather a Luddite, for heaven's sakes. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us today. I know that you will be stunned and surprised and exhilarated by our speaker today, but she is one example of the kind of excellent women that we've been able to support through the Charitable Trust because of your donations and the donations of your club and the insight of the charter members back in 1976. It's been a great run. We've given away millions of dollars. We continue to be really active in looking at how we need to reshape our the way we deliver programs and our scholarships to young women, and we make changes as we need. We've had 3 major changes this year. If people are interested in more details, please go to our annual report, which is on our website, CFUW charitabletrust.ca /. We have this year made 3 changes. One is that we no longer are charging for people to apply. We think this is a huge step forward and we're very pleased with it. It will mean that we're on a par with other scholarship applicants. We have, unfortunately, but responsibly, decided that we can no longer afford a full-time support system. So we're going to try to do what we've been doing with a company and with the board taking on more responsibilities to keep us going and flowing. And of course, one of those people who's been essential to that is Charlotte Rigby. Charlotte Rigby and her fellowships committee have been fabulous. They have taken all the changes that have happened in the last 3-4 years and run with them. So from 3 years ago, we are now virtual. Our meetings are virtual. We like to say that we are prescient because we started that process before we would have been forced to do it anyway through the pandemic. So meetings are virtual. We have applicants from across the country and we have adjudicators from across the country. They work hard and they are absolutely stellar. And we very, very much appreciate what they've been doing. The third is that we are now going to handle applicants and the results differently. So we before only notified the applicants who won the awards. This year, we're going to do letters out to everyone so that we can be more responsible in terms of getting back to our people and saying, we loved your application. It was excellent. Unfortunately, you didn't win, but please, and thank you for applying. So those are three major changes that we've made in this upcoming year. And again, one of the people who's been totally and absolutely responsible for our success in many of these areas is Charlotte, and I'm going to turn the speaker over to Charlotte.
There. Okay. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Doris May. And I'm here because as the, at this moment actually, as chair of the Fellowships Committee, one of the really fun parts of that job is in April getting to telephone the winners of we had 15 fellowships we awarded last year, and just give them a nice telephone to give them the good news. Now, one of the people, the women that I had to phone last year is our speaker today. Casey Oliver is going to speak to us today. Casey is the recipient of the CFUW award, the 1989 École Polytechnique Commemorative Award, and which is in memory of the Montreal students who were killed on that day. So we're very pleased to have Casey with us today, and I know we're all looking forward to her talk. Just a bit of an introduction to Casey. She's a PhD student at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. And over the past 6 years, she has been an active researcher on the topics of violence against women, working with researchers at the University of Western Ontario and Lakehead University. She's published on this topic in several peer-reviewed research journals, as well as written book chapters. She's also been involved in several legal projects on violence against women in Canada, and she has served on Lakehead University's Sexual Violence Task Force. So with that, I would ask you to welcome Casey. Welcome, Casey. We're looking forward to all the things you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna put on my presentation here. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
fine.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much to everyone for the warm welcome, and thank you so much for introducing me, Charlotte. I really appreciate it. And I'm very excited to be here today to talk more about my research and a topic that I'm very passionate about. So that is technology facilitated sexual violence. So in just giving you a bit more background about me, so I was born and raised in Southern Ontario, and then I went to the University of Waterloo to complete my bachelor's degree. After that, I pursued my master's degree at Western University. And then now I'm up north, or Northern Ontario at least, at Lakehead University. And here I'm studying to be a clinical psychologist. So my research interests have primarily fell within violence against women. So in my master's project, I looked at domestic homicide in Ontario. So the killing of women at the hands of their intimate partners. I've also looked at intimate partner violence more broadly. My current focus is on technology facilitated sexual violence, which I'll be telling you more about in a moment. And I'm also interested more broadly on the reproductive health of women. In there, I just have a kind of a joke picture. I'm wearing a lab coat, but that's not the type of research I do. That's just me mixing some hair dye. But so the topic of my research is one that you're likely all very familiar with. It gets a lot of media attention. So words and phrases like revenge porn, sextortion, cyber stalking, online threats against women, these really come out every day in the news. So it's something I think as a society we're very aware of, but in a kind of a research lens, we're less aware of it. In the last, I'd say, few years is when research in this area has really started to increase, but previous to that, it was really off researchers' radars. So some researchers in Australia, Henry and Powell, I would say are two of the kind of biggest researchers in the area who are kind of leading the charge. And they conceptualize technology facilitated sexual violence, or sexual violence that is perpetrated through technology, as being made up of 5 distinct categories. So I'm going to go through each of these now, just so we kind of have an understanding of what different types of acts and behaviors make up this type of violence. So first is sexual harassment. So the use of technology to kind of promote unwanted sexual attention, whether through text messages, being sent images. An often term here, at least in my generation, is typically dick pic. So being sent images of genitalia that are unwanted. Cyber stalking is another type of group of behaviors. So here we're looking at that kind of repeated and intrusive sexual contact. And this has often been researched in the intimate partner violence literature, actually, because of the use of technology that perpetrators will use in order to track their partner. Image-based exploitation is another category. This is where something like revenge porn would fall under. So essentially, it's both the creation and distribution of images without consent. The next category, which is unwanted sexual experiences that are facilitated through technology, is one that is, I would say, less talked about in the media. But an example of this is someone meeting another person on a dating app and then meeting up with them in person only to be sexually assaulted. So they're really using technology in order to facilitate those in-person assaults. And then finally, gender and sexuality-based harassment. So these are any type of derogatory remarks or comments that really target someone's gender identity or sexual orientation. So I think this framework is really useful for understanding all the different types of behaviors that are going on through technology. However, we are kind of moving into understanding this more as like a spectrum of behaviors rather than discrete categories, because many of these can be overlapping. And I think all of these have kind of a foundation of coercion and loss of like body autonomy. So all of them are very much so characterized by that essential feature. So in terms of some more numbers, so some early research in this, or more recent research in this area, is really showcasing how women are more likely to experience TFSV. And typically those who are young or who identify as a sexual or racial minority. Cripps and Sturmack, who are 2 researchers out of the University of Toronto, looked at the prevalence of these different categories of TFSV in an undergraduate sample of women. And they found that the gender and sexuality-based harassment category was more likely to be endorsed in that undergraduate sample, meaning that they had experienced it. And unwanted sexual experiences that are facilitated through technology was still present, but that was the one that was least endorsed or least selected as what had happened to these women. And then finally, in my master's thesis, we got more of an understanding of the context of TFSV. So really the who and the where of TFSV. So women were reporting that strangers, acquaintances, and friends were among the top perpetrators, really showcasing that those both familiar and unfamiliar to women are perpetrating these acts. And also that social media, chat applications, and dating sites tend to be the kind of main platforms where these behaviors are being perpetrated. So in kind of turning to my research that will make up my dissertation for my PhD, I really take both a feminist and an intersectional lens to all of my research, and that will be really important when I'm interpreting my findings. So really focusing on the experiences of women and also of particular women who might become more vulnerable to TFSV based on reduced power and privilege in our patriarchal society. So the online disinhibition effect really fits well with this research and also these other theoretical foundations, because the online disinhibition effect really showcases how perpetrators or individuals, often men who desire power and control, will use the features of technology like anonymity, accessibility, lack of legal consequences in order to perpetrate these acts against those who hold less power in society than them, often women. So these three theoretical foundations really are the crux of my dissertation project. So I think the first part of this presentation, now we're kind of moving into maybe more academic focus. So this is what my dissertation project will look like. Towards the end, I'll talk more about recommendations, more action-oriented items. But for now, I'm just going to tell you a bit more about where I'm headed with my dissertation project. So in terms of the literature, I've really focused on three central areas. So the pre-TFSV phase, so what's going on before these acts occur. So what types of factors may make women more vulnerable to this than others? I'm also interested in looking at what is happening during these events or during these acts, particularly the psychological distress that women are experiencing. And then I'm also interested in looking at coping in the aftermath of TFSV. So what are women doing in order to cope with these types of behaviors? So in terms of vulnerability, and I'll go through these slides quite quickly, just because I want to make sure I have time to talk about everything. I'm really focused on demographic factors because of that intersectionality focus, and also to see kind of replication of past studies that have really honed in on young age and racial and sexual identities. But I'm also interested in things like disability status as well as socioeconomic status. There are also some technological factors that have come up in the literature that my study will kind of be the first to kind of investigate more, just to see if women are more vulnerable based on these different factors as well. So psychological symptoms, so during TFSV, is really where a lot of this research is currently. And really what it's showcased is that women who experience TFSV more often has been linked with experiencing different psychological symptoms like depression, anxiety, etc. However, what we don't have is any data that really showcases a cause-effect relationship. So TFSV happens and then women experience symptoms right after. We don't have that type of data because all of this has been retrospective, meaning that it asks women about past events of TFSV. So this is where my dissertation is going to build on this body of research. And then lastly, in terms of coping with TFSV, here there's not really much out there in terms of the research literature, but we can draw on a lot of what's been done in the sexual violence in person literature. Here they're really focused on something termed a risk avoidance strategy. So these are strategies that women employ after having experienced sexual violence in order to reduce risk of a future incident happening. So an example of this would be, a woman being sexually assaulted and then deciding to install security cameras all over her home, also take part in self-defense classes. So we really want to better understand what the equivalent of those types of strategies are for women in technological environments. So how they are coping in terms of reducing future risk of these incidents happening. So in sum, my dissertation will be made up of 3 different studies that are focused on each of these kind of parts of the timeline. So and I'll talk really briefly about each of them in the next slides. So first is vulnerability. So this will be a survey study that I'll be asking women at Lakehead about their demographic factors and also about those technological factors. Study 2 gets a little bit more technical. So this is where I'm looking at psychological symptoms in the moment as TFSV is happening. So this will require the collection of real-time data. So for this one, I'm using a smartphone application, and there's lots of info here on the slide. So I'm just going to kind of do a brief overview. So I'll be using a smartphone application that women will be able to download on their smartphone. And anytime that a TFSV event happens over the 3-week duration of the study, they can go right on their phone and log what event happened and also what their mood is in that moment. And that will help us to kind of look at the cause-effect relationship between TFSV and psychological distress. So this is what the smartphone app looks like. It's called SEMA 3, and it's also from researchers in Australia, and it's very user-friendly. So I'm very thankful to be able to use something like this that has been developed for the collection of data in real time. And then finally, turning to coping. So in this area, I think it's really important that we hear the voices of women. So you'll notice that I'm using interviews in this portion of my dissertation. Again, really focused on those risk avoidance strategies because the literature really showcases how, though those can be empowering, like something like attending a self-defense class, that can be very empowering, but at the same time, it can be very restrictive, right? When you think about installing security cameras, there is a financial burden placed onto women in order to prevent sexual violence against them. So there's also some consequences to these strategies. So that's really what I'm seeking to understand in these interviews. And we also will be compensating women in each of these studies. Here, they can select to get a mark towards their course, or they can get a $25 gift card. So in sum, I know that was a very brief overview of my dissertation project and how it's evolved since I first applied to the CFUW fellowships. But the implications of this line of work really is understanding who may be targeted by TFSV, which then can help with things like education and really educating the more broader public as to the serious issue or the issues that are faced by women in the technological world, which then can have ramifications for things like their participation in employment and also in academics, because everything these days uses technology. And also my hope is to, promote future policy change, practice guidelines, and also future research in this area. So now turning maybe to more of the action-oriented portion of my presentation. So I first want to put my research into context. So I think this is a very good historical example. So I'm going to read through it. And this is from the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. It is alarming and disheartening to see the misogyny, the innate prejudice against women still exists in this world to the degree that it does. The harms caused to women, girls, and gender diverse individuals through the use of technology run deep. The social response to these harms, yet again, perpetuates male hegemonic values and unduly shames women and girls. This is sadly not at all new. Women have always been silenced in an effort to maintain patriarchal values. Women with marginalized social identities of race, class, sexual orientation, and disability were and are shamed and isolated even more. For example, the scold's bridle of the 16th and 17th centuries, an iron mask, was used to silence and punish female prisoners who questioned authority. Although shocking to look at images of this tool of torture, it is a new form of silencing and torture that we now see play out in the cyber world. So I think, for many of us, we can recognize this as maybe not a new issue because of its relationship with in-person sexual violence and other methods of silencing and punishing women. However, I think it's really important that we are dedicating our time to this area because, like I said, technology is everywhere, and we want to make sure that women can have equal participation and not fear for their safety. And also, that's historical, now current, thinking about what has gone on in Iran and how essentially technology is being wielded against women by the Iranian regime and how it very easily can be by governments. So also putting it into context as something that's very here and now. Okay, so you might ask me the question of like, what now? What do we do? And I'm really relying on two really great papers that were released from the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. And I'm doing so because it's a Canadian context, which is sometimes more difficult to find. So a lot of this research, Australia appears to be one of the leaders. So not all of their policy implications really play off in a Canadian context, though there is some to learn there. But I think these papers, which I'll show you at the end of my presentation, what they look like, I think are really important for understanding where we could be headed with this. So first, I think it's really important, and they raise this, that we really need to frame the gender-based nature of TFSV and also the harms. So we really need to shine a light on how women are harmed by technology and by these acts that are perpetrated through technology. We need to focus on men as perpetrators as well. And I think, again, these kind of recommendations are very much so in line with what has been done for in-person sexual violence. We, of course, need to focus on technologies and their companies. So we need them to be protecting rights and freedoms because they hold the power. They are influencing, millions, billions of users. So really the technology companies should play a key role in fighting against TFSV. And finally, it's really important to think about a systemic approach because, of course, when you think about violence against women, really is a symptom of, an overall kind of patriarchal society that we live in. So the UN set out 3 different kind of items that they feel are very necessary in order to prevent violence against women and girls through technology. So, of course, there's the change in societal values and norms being a really important part. Also, certain safeguards should be imposed that provide oversight and monitor online activity in order to minimize those risks. And then finally, they also say that we really need to provide for the ability to adapt and apply laws and regulations in order to define and enforce compliance and effective punitive consequences for perpetrators. Because again, going back to the online disinhibition effect, really that's one of the features of technology. The fact that there aren't any consequences is what perpetrators are really capitalizing on. So they further set out 14 different recommendations, and I'm not going to go through them all, but I've put, I think, 4 of them on this slide and the next, in order to give you an idea of some of the things, perhaps to start brainstorming over what could be done about TFSV. And here they refer to it as technology facilitated gender-based violence, again, with a lens towards incorporating or putting the focus on the gender nature of this. So, I mean, firstly, they talk about funding and also making widely available and also mandating research in this area, as well as education resources. They argue for establishing some sort of centralized expert regulator so that, number one, legal remedies are provided to survivors, and also that, you know, research and training and education is kind of continual for the public, stakeholders, and professionals. They also talk about how we really need some sort of law that allows for survivors to immediately remove any content that has been shared without their consent. Often, you know, survivors have to go through a whole court order process in order to get that type of content removed. And by that point in time, after, you know, it's been through the court order, often the harm has already been done. They also suggest that we really require these technology companies to provide users with a really accessible way to report abuse, and also that they expediently address and remedy these instances of TFSV and TFG-BDB. So I think it's also important to look at like what Canada is currently doing. So they've set out a digital charter in 2020, I believe, and these are the 10 principles of this digital charter. So in looking at it, you can really see that perhaps principle 9 really applies here. Others, of course, do as well, like consent, number 3. But number 9, you know, free from hate and violent extremism. I think some of these apply more to women because women are facing the brunt of things like hate speech and violence, and yet it's not centered in these principles. So that is one thing the digital charter hasn't done, is really centered the gender-based nature of violence through technology. So that's one major gap in the digital charter. And I know the Implementation Act right now is tabled. So I think there is still room for advocating for this to take the kind of gender-based lens into account. And as I said, Australia appears to be kind of ahead of the game in many regards in this area. One of the ways in which, so the government has kind of implemented this e-safety commissioner. So if you have experienced any sort of TFSV, so you can see the different options here, you know, someone made you feel threatened, intimidated, harassed, you can go to this website and you can click on the box that applies to what happened to you. And then they set out some different remedies for that situation. So it's very accessible for women and also very, you know, plain English, easy to read, which I think are really important features. And it's offered by the government, showcasing their understanding of what's going on, which is really important. So in conclusion to my presentation, I just want to leave everyone with this quote by Sweeney in 2014. So the internet has become just another alley in which women must walk faster and look over their shoulders into the night, but at least the streets have clear laws. I think that's something to take with you, really showing the areas in which advocacy needs to occur. The legal portions are really not there in order to have those kind of consequences for perpetrators so that it reduces their behaviors through technology ultimately. And, you know, ultimately, I really hope that my research, as well as other types of, you know, feminist scholar activism, advocacy, all of those kind of lenses or initiatives really help to make the streets of the technological world safer for women. And I just want to say thank you to CFUW for funding my graduate research, and also to these other funding sources for my graduate training. I couldn't do it without you. And I also have those papers that I was speaking to. This paper is really great, the tech facilitated violence that was released in 2021, and deplatforming misogyny is also really great, and that's where the 14 recommendations are. They've also released this, which is an infographic essentially for women survivors in how to proceed with things like legal initiatives or legal people that they can reach out to that will really help them to get some sort of remedy for the behaviors that they've experienced. And I just have some references at the end if anyone is interested. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. We don't have any questions in the chat. We're not a big group, so if someone wants to just raise their hand, or if you want to put a question into the chat, whatever you'd like.
I also could put my email in the chat in case any questions come up afterwards. That always happens to me, where I find I need to think on a topic and then questions come up later. So feel free to email me.
Okay. Very quiet group. There must be some questions. Joanne from Etobicoke, I thought it was so clever to have an app for smartphones that women could use. Yes.
Yeah, in some ways, you know, my project is using technology, and it's asking about really negative encounters that women have experienced through technology. So I've struggled with that myself, but I was glad that there was something that was very accessible to women. That's a good question.
What part does religion play in hate speech online?
Yeah, and also how many women do you think will complete this survey? So my hope is that we will have at least 150 women who are completing the survey through the app. And you know, I am fortunate to be at Lakehead, where we do have psychology students who are kind of willing and able to take part in these sorts of studies for course marks. So that is one way in which I think that I'll be able to achieve that sample size, but I think at some point I'll probably open it up to the community if I'm finding I'm not reaching a large enough sample size, because we're trying to establish a cause-effect relationship in that study, we do need a fairly large sample. So I'll have to be thinking about that as my research is underway. What part does religion play in hate speech online? I think that's a really difficult question to answer. I think religion is definitely, I think, a factor at play, and though not always, of course, but I think that is something that would be really interesting to study more about. I also think about different cultures of people online. So you may have heard of like involuntary celibates, like incels, like there is a whole climate. They have their own culture essentially online. And I think we can really point to these types of groups as playing a large part in hate speech and as well as sexual violence against women. So there is a lot to consider in terms of different aspects of culture that come through on the technological or in the technological world. Specific advice for parents of young girls. This is always a tricky one because I'm hesitant to make parents of young girls as well as the young girls responsible for protecting themselves from sexual violence that is perpetrated against them. So that is where it gets very tricky. I think I would probably have more advice for parents of young boys in terms of educating them as to the harms that happen, having very candid conversations about that, and also teaching responsible technology use. I think, many boys and men have, and even, women have this view of technology as being fully anonymous. But as we know, everything can be traced back to someone through IP addresses, etc. So I think it's really important to instill a little bit of that fear in boys and men, knowing that there can be consequences and repercussions for any of their actions. Oh yes, age, such an interesting, this is a piece of the work that I feel like is missing from my dissertation that I wish I could answer, because older women, that has really been a group that has been missed in past research. And, though I'm fortunate to have access to undergraduate women at Lakehead, that is a piece that I'm missing. There aren't, typically a lot of elder women in undergraduate training at Lakehead. So I think that's an area that we really need to investigate more. And I think right now they're saying that, research is showcasing that young women are more often targeted. But I also think that's likely because young women might be more engaged in technology. So I wonder about how much contact women have, and if that contact, like sexual violence is still occurring, even if it is reduced contact with technology. So I think that would be really interesting to look at in future research.
There's a question that came to me. CFUW did a sexual assault study. I believe that was violence on campus. The study was done a few years ago. I'm not sure if we revisited it. Maybe we should revisit and look at violence. Of course, the last couple of years, it's not been on campus, so it would have been online.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm actually interested about what might come out of that, because, like a platform like Zoom, I've heard about Zoom meetings being infiltrated by perpetrators of hate speech, etc. So I wonder if we'll be seeing more research coming out in that regard over the next year or so. So women journalists and politicians are public figures that are exposed to online hate. Are you including any data from them? So I'm not in my dissertation, though I totally agree that that is an understudied area and a very important area, because these are these women, figureheads that are being, I would argue, more so subjected to things like TFSV, which obviously creates more and more of a culture of it being accepted in society when we see this being perpetrated against figureheads, essentially. I would love to include data, and I know that there are some researchers who are employing strategies where they monitor online posting and different groups, like I mentioned, the incel groups. They really monitor that, and that's how they collect their data. And I think that's a very smart way to getting some of this information. So I'm looking forward to those types of research studies releasing their findings again in the next, hopefully, few years.
Yeah, the next one is about the CSW priority theme, innovation and technological change, education and digital age for achieving gender equality, empowerment of women and girls. Not necessarily specifically focused on the challenges around technology and how it can be used against women, but that would be part of it as well, as how valuable a tool technology is.
Yes, totally. And I think there are definitely both sides of that coin, right? There are many benefits and also many harms that can happen.
I think of where we would be for the last 2 years without Zoom and Microsoft Meets and other platforms like that. Yeah, it made a big difference. It's not the same as being there in person, but it's better than just hiding in your basement by yourself with no connection to anybody at all.
Yeah, totally. I've heard that people over 65 form a large percentage of online dating now. Yeah, I've also heard similar. So I think I'm hoping that researchers are turning their attention to all ages of women and not just just young women. I'd say that the focus has primarily actually been on adolescent women. Now we're moving towards more young women, and then I hope it kind of continues across the spectrum of age. It's really important.
I don't know if violence against older, it would be primarily women, I suppose, rather than men. Certainly there are seniors taken advantage of who don't really understand the technology. You know, someone wants to friend them, or, you know, they maybe are not as skeptical of what they hear or see online.
Totally. Yes. And that's actually one reason why I'm looking at technological factors in my dissertation, because I'm wondering if information can help reduce vulnerability, though again, the onus should not be on women, but I am curious about how that will apply to different age groups of women. Thank you for all of the lovely and stimulating questions and comments.
Are any other questions? Okay, I'm going to turn it over then to Sharon.
Hi, thank you so much, Council, for your presentation today. I'm sitting here as a retired high school principal thinking how helpless I felt years ago when young girls had troubles like this through the technology, how guidance counselors struggled, how parents didn't know what to do. And it's just very enlightening to realize that perhaps at this time, society is realizing that sexual violence, sexual assault goes way beyond the things that happen to particular people and places and the role that technology plays. It saddens me, though, to hear your areas where information is extremely limited, such as, you know, in the areas of vulnerability or coping, particularly because we all can think back probably of times when someone left their job, left school, isolated themselves, and often ended up in suicide. We all know those stories. So your research is so important, in my opinion, is so important to bring this information out to public, to stress what's happening with the technology, and to help us with the resources that you have presented or identified that might help when we run into troubles. I think that the smartphone app is outstanding because you'll get information so much more and faster than you might with a survey that goes out. I'm pleased to see all of the recommendations and suggestions that come from LEAP, because again, that's another place where we can go to help us. And also all the models that you've suggested, because years ago, none of this was available. So I'm going to thank you, Chelsea, for choosing the CFUW Charitable Trust Fellowship to give us your application. It was a pleasure to be on that committee, to read what you had to say, to read your passion and your commitment in your application, to hear your passion and commitment today. Thank you for taking on this most important research, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much to everyone and for being invited here today. I always like an opportunity to talk about this, so thank you so much for giving me the stage and space.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone who was able to join us today. I hope you enjoyed it. We certainly learned something, and we will continue to follow your research, Casey. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, and goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye,
Thank
take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.